Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on The Quiet American by Greene. It's my second favorite among his books. I think it's an excellent novel. I'm reading it as part of Dr. November, hosted by Mark over at Book Time with Elvis and a whole slew of other people. And it was good to return to this book. I last read it in 2012. I was a different person at the time. I wasn't married. I wasn't even engaged. And I read a whole bunch of sort of spy and spy adjacent novels over that summer. And this was one of them. This is one of them that I read and I focused on and I looked very carefully at. And I at the time I thought there were some really effective aspects to it. I thought Our Man in Havana was much funnier. This isn't a particularly funny book, but I thought it was a good book. I thought Greene, he's a good writer. This book still resonates in 2025, and it's for all of the wrong reasons. It is a book written in the 1950s that works on like three different levels. As with Greene, there's always, not always, but there's often this question about some type of romance subplot that's going on within the book. Sometimes that is the point of the book, like the end of the affair. But many times there is this romance happening within the book, and sometimes it's a very jaundiced view of love. Sometimes it is a more romantic view, and it feels less cynical, as in Our Man in Havana. But with The Quiet American, that's happening. There's also this sort of story about this conflict between these two characters. That we're told right at the beginning about a death. There's almost a Greek tragedy aspect to it, where the chorus comes in to tell us what's going to happen, and then we have to sort of examine how it happens, why it happens, what are the compelling motives happening across here. It's like something from Euripides. So Greene tells us in the first 20 pages, what has happened by the end of The Quiet American. But the real heart of this story, the heart of the matter, if you will, is Greene's just absolutely compelling look at the horror of the second half of the 20th century and into our 21st century. The modern horror of the callous and indiscriminate violence that can be done and perpetrated on people who have no idea why anyone around them or in their neighborhood or in their city or in their village would ever be attacked. They have no idea that this is coming. They have no way to defend themselves. They have done nothing to bring this about, and yet they are callously and indiscriminately murdered and killed in war. But they're just murdered. They have no way to defend themselves against those with more technology, more money, more power. And the way Greene pushes at that is utterly compelling. He introduces us to Thomas Fowler, this very cynical, agnostic atheist, jaded, separated from his wife who won't divorce him. He's been living in what is now Vietnam for some years as a journalist. He survived World War II in that area. And he is sort of seen he's watching the disintegration of the French colonial power there, and he comes into contact with Alden Pyle, this brilliant, enthusiastic young American. 10 years later, we would have thought that Pyle was like almost a send-up of John F. Kennedy's, bright young men, the best and the brightest. This is happening before Kennedy became president, and before the Peace Corps took off, and before the U.S. involvement in Vietnam skyrocketed and became the Vietnam War with magnitudes greater of violence and horror. But Greene is getting at that in the 50s, in the early 50s, and it's incredibly effective how he takes this view, this character who says, "I'm not involved. I don't get involved. I won't choose to get involved. I'm out of this," and he uses that voice, that window, to reveal if at the end of the book, if this character, if Fowler has got to the point where he cares about these people and he cares about what's being done, how can you as a reader not? That's almost what Greene is trying to get us to think. There are different motivations. We can be left to wonder just how cynical is Fowler's motivation in the choices he makes in the final 30 pages of the book. But I think that with Greene, there is a sense where he wants the reader to question, could it have been not that there was any noble motive for Fowler's choices towards the end. But could there be a sense that he recognizes the violence done to people as being wrong, and that there is some way for him to make a difference there, and that is as much of a motivating factor as it is any love triangle or anything like that. We are left to wonder which it is. Fowler himself, I think, wonders as a narrator in the first person which it is. But I think that's what makes the book so compelling, is the way that Greene takes that lens, that voice from Fowler, and then uses it to swivel around and say, okay, look at the world through this person's eyes, and once it starts to get to him, how is it not getting to you as a reader? And I think that's part of what makes the book just incredibly compelling still. The fact that the book prefigures so many decades of mechanized aerial distant violence, whether it is happening, regardless of the continent it's happening on, remains compelling, it remains horrifying, it remains totally relevant. Even in the past weeks, we're seeing, and the news is reporting on this happening in 3 different places just in the past week or two. And we are constantly riveted by this, but the way, one of the most effective things Greene does is he draws the reader in to see an immediate view. More and more we have found ways to separate ourselves from that news, but Greene is trying to bring it home before he, that was ever a thing to be able to do. So I did want to read a couple of passages that sort of get at Greene's style. It's an immaculate style. And then sort of the humanity, the character choices that are occurring within the book. I stood below the tower for a minute to get my vision back. There was starlight, but no moonlight. Moonlight reminds me of a mortuary and the cold wash of an unshaded globe over a marble slab. But starlight is alive and never still. It is almost as though someone in those vast spaces is trying to communicate a message of goodwill, for even the names of the stars are friendly. Venus is any woman we love. The bears are the bears of childhood. And I suppose the Southern Cross, to those like my wife who believe, may be a favorite hymn or a prayer beside the bed. Once I shivered as Pyle had done, but the night was hot enough. Only the shallow stretch of water on either side gave a kind of icing to the warmth. I started out towards the car, and for a moment when I stood on the road, I thought it was no longer there. That shook my confidence, even after I remembered that it had petered out 30 yards away. I couldn't help walking with my shoulders bent. I felt more unobtrusive that way. I had to unlock the boot to get the blanket, and the click and squeak startled me in the silence. I didn't relish being the only noise in what must have been a night full of people. With the blanket over my shoulder, I lowered the boot more carefully than I had raised it, and then, just as the catch caught, the sky towards Saigon flared with light and the sound of an explosion came rumbling down the road. A Bren spat and was quiet again before the rumbling stopped. I thought somebody's had it, and very far away heard voices crying with pain or fear or perhaps even triumph. I don't know why, but I had thought all the time of an attack coming from behind, along the road we had passed, and I had a moment's sense of unfairness that the Viets should be there, ahead, between us and Saigon. It was though we had been unconsciously driving towards danger instead of away from it, just as I was now walking in its direction, back towards the tower. I walked because it was less noisy than to run, but my body wanted to run. And I think there we have that sense of just how Greene is trying to write about a war and write about violence in a way that brings us the immediacy of a character's experience, without it feeling completely divorced from experiences of going out to a car at night or going out taking out the garbage at night and hearing something and being like, wait a second, I can't see what's in front of me. What is beyond that? The fact that he has been, in this sort of like wooden tower with a pair of Vietnamese soldiers and with Pyle, and now has gone out to get stuff out of the car, kind of brings this different sensibility to it. But Greene is always trying to like bridge the immediate gap and the reader and the experience in some way. In another passage at the beginning of the book, he notes, I walked back with Fong towards my flat. I was no longer on my dignity. Death takes away vanity, even the vanity of the cuckold who mustn't show his pain. She was still unaware of what it was about, and I had no technique for telling her slowly and gently. I was a correspondent. I thought in headlines. American official murdered in Saigon. Working on a newspaper, one does not learn the way to break bad news. And even now I had to think of my paper and to ask her, do you mind stopping at the cable office? I left her in the street and sent my wire and came back to her. It was only a gesture. I knew too well that the French correspondents would already be informed. Or, if Vigo had played fair, which was possible, then the censors would hold my telegram till the French had filed theirs. My paper would get the news first under a Paris dateline. Not that Pyle was very important. It wouldn't have done to cable the details of his true career, that before he died, he'd been responsible for at least 50 deaths, for it would have damaged Anglo-American relations. The minister would have been upset. The minister had a great respect for Pyle. Pyle had taken a good degree in, well, one of those subjects Americans can take degrees in, perhaps public relations or theater craft, perhaps even Far Eastern studies. He had read a lot of books. And that's not a spoiler. That's on the 13th page of the book. So as I said, the book, it acts as this Greek tragedy where we're told right away, this is this event that has happened. And Fowler then is taken back into the past of how did he meet Pyle? He remembers that experience. How did they come to, both desiring the same woman, Phuong? And what is her agency? The way that each views her from his perspective and objectifies her and sort of recognizes how the other is objectifying her, but never really seeks to give her a voice and give her agency. And Graham Greene never seeks to do that. It is something that stays with the reader. But towards the end of the book, there's a line about death is not discriminate, that a 200-pound bomb does not discriminate, that setting something like that off, even if it's, he asks how many kernels, weigh in the balance against, how many children weigh against those kernels' lives. Like if they're trying to kill one kernel, how many other people who have no part in this conflict can die, and it's still in the balance. And that is something that Fowler never quite comes to reconcile. We see where Pyle lands on that question. We sort of get a sense of where Fowler lands on the question. I think we have a sense of where Greene lands on the question, but we don't know where Phuong lands on that question. And we as readers must decide and make that decision. And so the book is very, very, very strong. As again, I said, it's terrifyingly relevant. And it is a book that stays with the reader for many years to come. Now there are other works I thought of. The introduction to this edition is by Robert Stone, whose Dog Soldiers, written about 20 years later, is one of the great books dealing with how sordid the Vietnam War could be on a personal level, and what the deep ramifications could have for someone who could not separate themselves from conflict, who could not take this bird's eye view and try to weigh in a balance human lives. It is utterly, utterly compelling. Jean Lartigue, The Centurions is a book that takes the French perspective and is worth examining, if only to realize just how warped the characters in the Centurions are, or the people who thought that this was, crucial and heroic, how warped views could be. I think there are ways in which The Quiet American really parallels Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, and sort of in a way is with its anti-colonialism perspectives and questioning those and skepticism around it is sort of an update of Heart of Darkness 50 years later. I really think that. I had mentioned, I would say The Comedians is his strongest book. That and The Power and the Glory is really close as well. A very different Greene novel would be The End of the Affair, which I think parallels sort of the Fowler sort of his, can he get a divorce? What does it mean to be in a relationship knowing you can never be married because you can't get a divorce? Those are questions that Greene examines in The End of the Affair in much more detail. Jean Le Carre's Carla trilogy with George Smiley has The Honorable Schoolboy, which takes place in Hong Kong and Vietnam in the aftermath of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and is very, very strong. Charles McCarry's Tears of Autumn picks up sort of 10 years after The Quiet American, and looks at the U.S. involvement specifically in the assassinations of the Diem brothers. And then I would add something like A Tomb for Boris Davidovic by Danilo Kish, with his way of looking at the ways people justify violence within a totalitarian state in Europe, and how that parallels some of the casual arguments about a third way, or, you know, Pyle's update of making the world safe for democracy in the 1950s. And finally, I would say the voice that Fowler has, this voice, this cynical, sort of ragged voice that rises towards Poetry Times, reminded me a little bit of Jeffrey Furman, the consul in Under the Volcano by Malcolm Lowry. And I'll link my video on this in the description box below. But let me know what you think of The Quiet American. If you're a fan, if you find it to be just as powerful still, 75 years on. And I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.